This story is Hunting with My Father, written by LupusCreepus. This story was collected from the Creepypasta.org website and is read by Mahonbr, the collector. I originally decided to start reading these stories out loud because I have recently recovered from blindness, and I solely relied on visual or audio recordings of stories rather than simply reading a book because I was unable to see. Now that I've recovered, I decided what I would do is to start reading stories out loud, so if someone else is blind or they just prefer to listen to stories rather than reading them, they'll still have the opportunity to be able to experience those stories. So now, The Hunting with My Father, read by me. I would also like to point out that since I am just beginning, I will likely speak incorrectly at some points, whether I'm stuttering or pausing in the middle of speech, and that is just me being a poor narrator as I'm just beginning. But I'm hoping as I gain more experience it will come more naturally and it will seem less mechanical and forced as it probably does right now. Creepypasta has meant a great deal to me when I was younger, and although it isn't as popular as it used to be, I know there are other channels such as Creepypasta or some other I can't think of at the moment, and I'm not trying to compete with those channels at all. And one, I would have no chance given their large fan base. Two, I'm not looking for popularity, as you can see, as my videos will have no ads in them unless I have copyrighted music, which I cannot prevent. And three, that those channels were the ones that inspired me to start doing this to begin with, and that I may accidentally create a video that someone else has, whether it's a Little Big Planet video or a Creepypasta video. But those two things were very important to me as I've grown up into the person I am now. And if I can share that with my future self, or people I meet, or just random people who stumble across it on the internet, then that's fine with me. I am completely fine if this has no views, and I know that I'm using a poor microphone, which I'm using my iPad, and I do not currently have a microphone. I have a very cheap computer, and I do not have a working camera. And if I continue on with this, I will likely invest to have higher quality items, but as of right now, that is not the case, so I will have a poor audio recording with no camera, and stories that other people might have already written or read out loud on channels such as Creepypasta. I'm hoping to record stories that have not previously been recorded, but given that the internet is so vast, I have no way of knowing that, and I'm not very connected with other YouTube channels, to be honest. I do this more independently. Yeah. I'm just doing this, to be honest, just because I enjoy it. I love scary stories. I'm writing scary stories. I love horror movies and shows, and I always just loved being scared at reading stories at night. So I'm hoping as I continue, I'll be a better voice actor, and that the stories will be more believable, and that the audio will be better. But now I know I'm belaboring, and I'm repeating myself, and you probably just want to hear the story at this point, so I'll shut up so you can start listening to that. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. It's Hunting with My Father, it's a very relatable story just because I was at one point very close to my father until a traumatic event. And who knows, maybe this is the story that will make me realize that I should rekindle our relationship. So this is the story of hunting with my father. Please enjoy.
Relax, son. Close one eye and keep focused on your target, my father spoke calmly from behind me. I tried to do as he said, letting my muscles relax. One eye closed, ending the double vision I had from having the rifle's sight so close to my gaze. That's good, he continued. Now, when you're ready, hold your breath. Don't hold it for too long or you're gonna start shaking. Just enough. Then, slowly squeeze the trigger down, like you're milking a cow. I had to chuckle at that. Dad, I've never milked a cow before, I spoke as I glanced up to him. He furrowed a brow and adjusted the baseball cap on his head. Well, that's how my dad described it to me. You know what I mean. I smiled a bit and shook my head. It wasn't the first time my dad described how to shoot to me, or the second, or even the third. He tended to repeat himself sometimes. I didn't mind though. I looked back to the target through the sight and concentrated. I still took everything he said in. I relaxed, letting muscles loosen enough. I shut one eye, focusing on that bullseye down at the end of the barrel. My breath held in my throat, and slowly I squeezed the trigger down. The rifle jumped in my hands, jerking heavily as it bounced back. My head jerked backward a bit, uneasy of the weapon as it leaped up. I was still a bit nervous since the last time I went to the range and the scope smacked me in the eye, bruising and cutting the brow. I couldn't see from where we stood at the shooting range station, but I felt good about the shot. My dad leaned into the spotting scope we had set up, looking through it. A small nod and I saw a smile curl up on his lips. Not bad, take a look. I rose up and shifted to look through the scope myself. I took a bit of a moment to focus through it before I could see the small, black hole in the target down at the other end of the range. It wasn't a bullseye, but just a bit high and to the left. My dad nodded and placed a hand on my shoulder. If that was a deer, it'd be a clean hit. I smiled at his words and turned back to him. You think I actually have a shot at hitting something this weekend? He shrugged his shoulders and then let out a breath. It's possible, he said. We'll sure as hell try. Now see if you can actually hit the bullseye this time. I chuckled and shook my head. Back to the station I went. I lifted the rifle up, focused again. Maybe, with a bit of luck, we might come back with something on this hunting trip. That'd be a change. I haven't shot since that day at the rifle range. I wasn't too worried though. Apparently I was a pretty decent shot. No bullseyes, but hey, close enough really. I was getting used to the .300 short mag Browning rifles my dad got for us to use. They packed a hell of a kick, but with a padded stock and a firm grip, you could keep it under control. My dad had been planning this trip for a while, got the 2 Brownings specifically for it. The plan was that I, my dad, my Uncle John, would head up to this out in the middle of nowhere place, where my dad used to deer hunt with his father, do the same for the weekend. To be honest, I wasn't really big on the whole outdoors thing. It meant being too hot in the day, too cold at night, bugs everywhere, and the constant overwhelming feeling of needing a shower. However, I wanted to do it for my dad. My father, Fred, wasn't doing all that hot. Recently, he had cancer, severe case of vasculitis. It really knocked him down a few notches. A couple of years ago, I remembered a strong and fearless man who could make someone back down with a hard stare. Now, he was immensely different. A lot skinnier, and he had the look of a man that stared real death in the face. It rattled him. It made me realize I may not have as much time as I thought with this man. Probably what my uncle was thinking as well. John wasn't my dad's brother, but my mom's. He was a bit more the city type, like me. He taught at one of the local high schools and delved into a number of random hobbies. Lately, it had been photography. Even as we drove up, I could see that he had the fancy new Nikon DSLR camera set about his neck on the strap. We brought 3 guns with us, the 2 Brownings and my dad's old .30-30 rifle, but we didn't expect John to shoot anything unless it was with his camera. I figured the only real reason my dad brought along his .30-30 was because of the nostalgia, rather than for all of us to shoot. It was the gun he used with his father, and he kept it like it was brand new. Even with the proper care and maintenance, it was still old, and the new Brownings were much more solid. Even got them set up with brand new scopes and shoulder straps. The works. If a deer came across our path, we'd have the gear to take it down. We arrived at our hunting grounds in the afternoon. It was a few hours from where we lived, then another hour driving along a dirt and gravel road. That was the most boring. Car couldn't go more than 15 miles on the road, all the bumps and dips. Finally, we reached our spot, which turned out to be a bit of a clearing in the middle of a large group of trees. I don't remember the exact location, just that it took quite a ways to get there. We set our camp up, just a large single tent for the 3 of us, and packed some of our gear. John had made sure to grab some of that nice camping cook gear. My dad had pre-cooked some ribs and chicken that we'd just have to warm up. First thing we did after setting up was eat. "So, Fred," John began as we munched on some ribs, "what are the odds of getting a deer out here?" "As good as anyone else's," my dad shrugged. There was a bit of a pause before John spoke again. "Let's say we get a deer. Then what do we do then?" John quirked a brow as he focused on my dad. It seemed an innocent question, but I knew where it was going. The question meant, if we got a deer, how did we plan on taking care of that heavy thing in the middle of the brush? Or, more specifically, how did my dad plan on taking care of it? John's a good guy, but he might have been overly concerned for my dad. My dad lost a lot of his strength in the hospital, but he wasn't feeble yet. Dad hated it when people thought he was. "We'll lug it up and carry it back here," he spoke shortly, a bit of annoyance slipping into his voice. "David can handle it, right, son?" he asked me with a bit of a smile. I returned it with one of my own and nodded. "Yeah, I can take care of it. I'm stronger than I look." My dad's smile grew, and John shrugged his shoulders. We finished soon after, and the sun was starting to show the first signs of beginning to sink down toward the horizon. "You know, we'll have a couple of hours before it gets dark," Dad said as he gazed up at the sky. "You want to take a bit of a walk and see if we get lucky?" "Sure," I replied. "Why not?" John nodded in agreement, and soon the 3 of us were trudging off into the trees. Only Dad and I carried our guns, both of us wielding brand new Brownings. John was content just having his camera. Dad moved on through the thin path, leading the way as he seemed to recall memories of himself and his father. I trudged along behind him, my rifle slung about my shoulder. John had the rear, his hands lingering near his camera. Every once in a while, I'd hear a soft click as he'd shoot a picture of some sort of eye-catching scenery while we walked. We didn't find much. No deer, and hell, we didn't even see any animals except random birds and the horde of bugs. I was starting to get tired and my legs began to hurt. It had been a long day. I wanted nothing more than to go sit down and relax a bit before conking out. Cooking out. The cold started to get in as the sun sunk lower, nipping at me even through my jacket. Dad pushed on before he stopped and bent down. "Find something?" I asked as John and I both came up and looked down at the ground. My dad pointed out something in the soft dirt. A set of cloven tracks pressed on through the dirt, running along the path for a bit. "Deer tracks," he smiled a bit and rose, carefully moving to follow them along the path. "They go along here and then," he trailed off as he furrowed a brow and crouched back to the ground. Then, I asked as John and I approached. Dad, once again, pointed to the ground. We could see what he was looking at. The prints suddenly shift and seemed to move toward the forest, off the path. But that's not what was unusual. There were 2 more footprints in the dirt, next to the deer's, and pointed in the direction that the deer ran off in. That a bear? John asked my dad, while he focused on those 2 prints in the earth. I thought they might be from a bear myself, but they looked odd. My dad noticed it too. Bear prints have a distinct shape where the paw lands in the dirt, and 5 toes, though you might miss the little one depending on how the bear was moving. These prints only had 3 toes, and an elongated print where the base of the paw fell, and the claw marks above the 3 toes dug deep into the ground. It almost seems like if you gave a person 3 toes instead of 5, threw on some thick, deadly claws, that he would make this footprint. And the size of them didn't make me feel all that comfortable looking at them. Not the right shape, Dad finally spoke as he stood. And it's not a mountain lion either. Bigfoot? I asked, with a bit of a nervous chuckle. I tried to lighten the darkening mood. Well, they say he could be out here, Dad remarked with a bit of a grin, though I could tell he was only joking back with me to raise the mood as well. All 3 of us could feel it, an uneasiness that was starting to set in. A chill ran through me as I stared at those prints, and not from the cold. Maybe we should call it a day, before it gets too dark, John suggested. Nobody argued. We turned and began to move back down the path. I kept a hand up on the shoulder strap of the rifle, ready to slip it off if I needed to. I noticed Dad was doing the same. We didn't say much when we got back. John started a fire before it got too dark. The 3 of us sat around it for a little while as night fell. It actually seemed rather peaceful. I could hear the light chirps of crickets in the woods, even the flutter of some nighttime birds flying by. Light chat began to start up again, and we found ourselves forgetting about those weird prints. John and my dad spoke about random things like the shows they watched on TV, or the memories my dad had of this area. I sat back and just relaxed. Even though as a city boy, it was nice to get out with my family. I could tell my dad was enjoying himself. It seemed fuller, much more alive. Maybe the memories of good times were helping him recover. I hoped that making some more helped him too. When we went to bed not long after that, John put out the fire, and the dark night fell over the camp, only the stars and the moon shedding enough light for us to get comfortable in the tent. As I drifted off to sleep in my sleeping bag, I noticed one thing though. Maybe I was just too tired to really care, or my mind forced me to ignore it. But it seemed strange when the sounds of the forest seemed to stop. The crickets ended their song, and the shifting of hidden, nocturnal animals ended. I could feel a familiar uneasiness building back up in my stomach as sleep claimed me. The same feeling I had when all gazed upon those strangely shaped tracks, with claws that seemed to sink deep into the earth below. I woke up from a dreamless sleep to a smell that flew in and hit me right in my core. Bacon. I rose from my sleeping bag, slipped on a new set of clothes, and moved outside of the tent. John stood at the camping fire he got, frying up a fresh patch of bacon while my dad double-checked the guns, making sure they were ready for today's trek. "Morning, David," John spoke with a grin as he held up the pan. "Almost done here. Got some eggs, too." "Oh, bacon and eggs in the woods." I wasn't complaining. We ate breakfast happily, joking around a bit and fantasizing about all the different ways we were going to cook the deer we were sure to nab on this trip. Last night's weirdness was completely forgotten. After breakfast, we cleaned up and Dad handed me one of the Brownings. "You ready for this, son?" he asked with a bit of a smile. I nodded and took the rifle before slinging it over my shoulder. Hell yeah, be good to get an early start this time too. Both father and son readied their weapons as John made sure that his camera was fully set for the day. He even snapped a photo of the 2 of us, grinning at the camera. I felt good. It had been a while since my father and I had gotten a chance to really do something together. The time in the hospital had been long and stressful. Still remember walking into his room, seeing him hooked up to all those machines, this look that screamed, "Help me," but I couldn't do a damn thing. Before that, we've had a bit of a rough patch. Just stupid years of me being a dumb teenager, leading up into being a dumb young adult. Now I felt closer to him than ever. Felt like we were building up the family again. I'll never forget that feeling. Then we strode off into the wild, Dad on point, John taking up our rear. We moved along the path again, our eyes peeled for anything moving in the woods, and ears listening for just the slightest sound. Overall, it was a quiet morning that led into a quiet afternoon. We walked and moved, climbing over fallen trees that obscured the path, or slipping through overgrown areas where the plants worked to reclaim areas that man and animal, mostly animal, trudged through. I admit I was starting to get bored and tired. You can only walk so long and not see anything before you get a bit dispirited. Dad didn't show any signs of exhaustion though. Even after getting out the hospital this soon, he moved like he had a purpose. I figured we'd eventually come across a tree, a bit too large or an overgrown patch a bit too thick, but he moved on through without a word of complaint. And so, through the brush we went, the three of us searching for the wounded deer. When we came across the spot it had lingered in, the result was clear. A fresh patch of blood had covered a nearby tree and splashed the dirt on the ground. My dad just grinned and sent an "I told you so" look over to my uncle before he took a few steps. Sure enough, in the direction the deer ran off in, another splash of blood had stained the earth. "Got him," my dad said with a triumphant pump of the fist. "Now, let's get him back. He's not going to be too far, I bet." The blood trail led on for a good distance. At times, there were sections where I lost the trail completely. I couldn't tell if we had taken a wrong turn, or if the deer had maybe stopped bleeding. My dad kept right on it, and, sure enough, we'd find a new splash of blood, brownish red, that mixed in with the dirt. The trail led straight to a large overgrown set of brush that appeared trampled and squished, like something hard fell upon it. A large pool of blood lay splattered over those plants, sunk into the earth below them. Seems like a clear idea that the deer had staggered here and then collapsed onto this brush. But no deer. Only the blood and torn up plants indicated that something heavy and bleeding had fallen here. My dad once again adjusted the ball cap on his head and moved up to investigate. "That's weird. Looks like he should be right here," he commented as he ran a hand along one of the bloody leaves of the plant. "I don't think he could have got up after falling with a hit like that." John and I stepped forward to look up as well. It did seem like something had fallen here. It had to have been the deer. What else was recently wounded and bleeding? John was the first to notice something strange. He moved around the back of the brush and found an area behind it trampled to the ground. Blood streaked along the leaves and the ground below before moving off into the woods, like something was being dragged. John waved my dad over, who took a look with a thoughtful gaze. "You think something took off with it?" John questioned. "Maybe, but this quick? Doesn't seem possible." Dad sighed and shook his head. I stood back, both curious and nervous, memory of a certain set of footprints coming back into my head. "Let's take a look," John suggested after a moment. "Shouldn't be too far." Curiosity must have got the best of all of us. We began to walk in the direction of the blood streaks. They were very different from the splotches we saw on the way here. Instead of the more circular splatters, each bit of the blood trail rolled along the earth in a curving line before stopping, only to resume again a few feet onward. I didn't notice the chirping of birds and animals stop, or the cease in the buzzing of insects. I did notice the faint sound of something squishy being torn. My dad must have heard it too, and he slipped the rifle off of his shoulder as we all hunkered down and moved as silently on as we could. I was the first to see it, and, dear God, I was thinking for the brush. Otherwise, I might have seen all of it head-on in the daylight. In the distance, through the trees, appeared to be a creature crouched down over something. It was hard to make out through the brush in the distance, but I could distinctly see brownish black fur or skin and a muzzle. All three of us stopped and watched it in awe and silence. As I looked closer, I thought I could see that the fur only seemed to be in patches on it. There seemed to be blood starting to coat areas of it. It leaned over and bit down into something in the ground, which was the deer. I could see a bit of these forked antlers sticking up. I also saw what I thought was a hand raise up, large scythes of claws gleaming on a three-fingered hand, before it lowered it to dig down and tear more into the meat. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up. This thing made those tracks earlier. I knew it. Dad was looking off in quiet shock while John seemed to finger his camera, debating whether or not to take a picture. It was then that the creature snapped its head up, and I caught my first look at gleaming, bloodshot red eyes. It stared directly at us. A screech then emitted from it, high-pitched and graining, like the vibration of the sound was causing part of its inner throat to tear apart, and then launched itself in our direction, still screeching that ghastly sound. My dad rose to his feet and angled the gun, standing as he yelled something to John and me. I assumed it was run, because John turned and took off. I rose and held my ground as Dad fired off of a shot that I knew would miss. Through those trees and with a moving target, he'd be lucky to hit it with the rest, but standing? No chance. The shot did cause the thing to veer off, into the trees toward our right side. That's when my dad turned and began to run himself. I bowled off with him, my heart jumping to my throat as I ran. I could hear the trees crashing on our right side, then our left. Could it switch that quickly? That screech emitted once again, and this time felt like the terrified deer running through the woods as impending death loomed over me. I don't know how long Dad and I ran for, but enough that I felt my legs start to cramp up and my breath to wheeze. Dad wasn't looking too hot either. He stumbled and gulped in ragged gasps of air. His recent issues must have finally been catching up. Still, he pushed on, and I did with him. I never left his side. Even as he slowed, like hell was I going to leave him, while that thing was chasing us. I could tell he wanted me to push forward, to leave him escape on my own. My mind went to a joke my dad used to tell, two campers and one bringing running shoes. The other asked why he brought running shoes and if he expected to outrun a bear. His friend answers, "No, I just have to outrun you." Well, this wasn't a joke. I don't know how we managed it. Soon the two of us burst into our campsite, gasping and wheezing for air. Dad coughed and moved over to the car, leaning against it with an arm up. He coughed and spat as I bent over and gasped. Looked up to him, still coughing and lurching. I felt my stomach twist. He wasn't doing well. Slowly, I came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Dad?" I asked quietly. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he spoke in a ragged voice in between coughs. I'm okay. Are you okay?" Heh, still worried about me when he was the one that looked like he would cough up a lung. "I'm alright," I reassured him before I lifted my head. That's when I realized something, as I looked about our solitary campsite. John was nowhere in sight. I stepped away from my dad, my eyes looking around the camp. It looked untouched, just the way we left it this morning. But John wasn't here. I looked back to Dad, who seemed to finally recover and push himself away from the car. "John's not here," I told him as I looked around. My dad cursed and his gaze wandered back toward the woods, where the creature had been. My eyes followed him, and I swallowed down some of the bacon and eggs that tried to come back up. You think he's out there? You think that thing? We'll find him, my dad cut me off as he drew in a breath. Get some fresh water ready for us and some food. Make sure you got ammo, he commanded. I didn't question him. I moved and refilled our canteens with water, stuffed some of the quick snack foods we brought with us into small bags. I double-checked my ammunition, found my clip still full. I hadn't fired a shot. Dad moved to the car and pulled out a box of .300 short mag rounds before setting it out the hood. The clip in his rifle came out and he replaced the 2 shots he fired swiftly before oddly hesitating as he went to slip the clip back in. Instead, he turned to me and extended the clip out. Here, son, that will give you an extra one, he said firmly as I gave him an odd look. Dad, what about you? I asked as I lifted my hand to take the full clip from him. He turned back toward the car and reached in again, soon slipping out his old .30-30 rifle. Without a second thought, he began to load it with ammo from an old and beat-up .30-30 box he had brought with him. I shook my head and came up next to him. No, Dad, that gun's old, and we're going to need power if we come across that thing. We have short magnum, Dad. The .30-30 is my gun, he replied quickly and curtly. It's reliable. I used this gun for 30 years, and it still shoots like it's brand new. I know it, and there'll be plenty. Besides, you got the short mag. After loading the rounds, he turned and put a hand on my shoulder. We can take care of it. Now, are you ready? I looked away from him into those woods. Those same woods which, for this moment, did not seem so dark and ominous. Even in the daylight, the trees seemed to suck up the light like a vampire, leaving shadows where a sickening, patchy-furred monster might be waiting to creep up on us and tear us apart. We're going after John? I asked, as I kept my gaze focused on that forest, trying to pierce the darkness and hoping I didn't find 2 bloodshot eyes staring back at me. We're going to get him back. A deep breath and I nodded before slipping the extra clip into my pocket. My hands went to unsling the rifle from my shoulder. I finally looked back to my father. Okay, I spoke, my voice coming out much quieter than I meant to. Let's go. Our search began in late afternoon while the sun seems like it was in the losing battle of staying high in the sky. Yearning back into those woods while that thing was still out there terrified me like hell. I'd already witnessed it tearing apart that deer, and now John was missing. I secretly hoped he just got lost on the way back. We'd find him trying to get back to the path. I hated to think I was hoping he was just lost, but the alternative meant that a monster. I forced those thoughts from my head and gripped my rifle tightly. My eyes wandered over to Dad as we moved. He stepped swiftly and carefully, eyes looking about him. Every once in a while, he stopped and would just listen before moving on. I was glad he had that hunting experience. It would really help us now. Still, I could tell he was nervous. The hands that gripped his trusty gun were gripping too tightly, and shaking just a bit. Oh, Dad, I had that same fear in me too. The sky grew darker and still we searched. Thankfully, most I heard and saw were bugs, small animals scurrying around. No creature yet. That didn't mean it wasn't still out there, watching and waiting. Suddenly, I saw Dad stop and bend down near a large tree. I moved after him carefully and as quietly as I could. He reached down and picked up what looked like to be the mangled remains of a DSLR camera. It looked crushed, the body smashed in, the lens broken off. Worst thing was, I could see the smears of blood that coated the camera and the neck hanger.
I couldn't hold back anymore. I turned and retched. My body fell over as I let loose what remained of bacon and eggs in my stomach, all over the forest ground. My dad didn't say anything. He just looked down and sighed. He knew. We both knew. As I knelt on the ground, trying to recover, I saw my dad rise to his feet and step off through the trees. A few long breaths, and I pulled myself up, after composing myself before sprinting after him. He walked for a ways, every once in a while glancing down toward the ground, then looking up. I didn't care to look. I knew what he was following. I just didn't want to believe it. It wasn't long before the smell hit me. The coppery scent of fresh blood stung at my nostrils, and I held my breath. No, this wasn't it. We're going to find a deer, a bear, anything. Not this, though. Not this. I tried to calm myself down. I just lied to myself. We soon found John. My dad tracked the blood smears I refused to look at. A large one splattered against a big tree. He was slumped over in the branches, hanging down as drops of blood fell down to the base of the tree, mixing with wood and dirt. I only could look for a moment before I had to turn away, but it was enough to see the gouge marks running along his arm that hung limply over the branch, swaying in the light wind, and the bits of flesh and intestine that threatened to spill out with just the slightest movement. My dad grimaced and curled his lip. He just stared up, and I could see moisture building in his eyes. He looked from the tree and over to me, and I knew what was going on through his head. John's dead. My uncle and his brother-in-law is dead. The two of us were still stuck here with the killer. I was in danger. I knew what he was seeing in his head. Dad saw me, hung up in that tree, blood dripping along a lifeless body. He turned away quickly, and he reached a hand to grab my shoulder. "We're leaving," he said, so quickly and quietly it took me a moment to understand. Already, he began to drag me through the trees back toward the camp. I moved along listlessly, in a daze at recent events. It was getting to be too much. One of us was already dead, and we could very well join him soon. I bit back tears and moved faster. I wanted out. I wanted home. I wanted away from this sickening thing. Darkness swiftly poured in. I didn't realize how long we were searching, and how quickly night fell upon this area. As the darkness fell, our pace increased. Soon, it almost felt like we were running again back to camp. My thoughts wandered back to this afternoon. I nearly choked as the fresh memory of that creature screeching, barreling after us rose up in my head. I could almost hear it out there, running along with us through the trees, ready to pounce and rip us to shreds. I let out a sigh of relief when my dad and I slipped back into that camp clearing. He didn't hesitate, took one last look around for John, then moved for the car. "What about our stuff?" I asked as I came up to him, motioning to our gear. We still had our tent, the cooking supplies, the food, everything else we just left lying about. "We don't need it," Dad said as he threw open the car door. "It's all replace that screech. That fucking screech cut him off. From the side of the car, I saw it. It burst out and reared up. I only saw it up close for a second, but it felt like more. It seemed to have enough time to see every detail. I seemed to have enough time to see every detail. The reason why its brownish-black fur looked to be in patches seemed to be because there were parts of its black skin that looked diseased and rotted. It was tall and scrawny, overly scrawny, with bones that jut out in a way that made them seem like they'd tear through thin skin at any moment. It had a canine-like muzzle with jaws that opened to thick and sharp, yellowed fangs. It was reared up on thin back legs that ended in elongated three-toed feet, equipped with 3 long claws that dug into the earth where it stood. A 3-clawed hand rose and smacked my dad in the chin, causing him to be flung back into the ground. The .30-30 rifle fell away from his grasp and landed in the soft dirt a few feet away from him. The creature then turned to me, those blood-red eyes focusing on mine as I looked up into his gaze. My mouth hung open in shock as it snarled down at me, sickly black-colored drool oozing from its jaws. I at least remembered my rifle and brought it up to point the barrel at it. The creature's arm shot out, hand grasping around the barrel, and, with strength I didn't think that scrawny form could have, wrenched it out of my grasp and chucked it away from me. I backed up and was about to turn and run when it leapt. I felt a heavy form crash over me. sending my back down into hard dirt. I could smell it as it tackled and held me down. Stench of rotting flesh and dried blood assaulting my nostrils. I'm going to die now. God, I'm dead. That's all I could think as I saw it raise a clawed hand up. A loud sound echoed suddenly, the sound of something hard smacking into flesh, and the creature stumbled off of me. It took that moment to turn and crawl away, panting heavily before I risked looking back. I saw my dad standing there, both hands clutched together in front of him after he apparently sent a hard haymaker into the back of the creature. Hell, I didn't know he had the strength left in him. The monster already covered and rose back up, this time hissing and screeching at my father. My dad glanced at me, and my breath caught in my throat. He wasn't hoping to beat it. He just wanted to distract it, get it away from me. My dad was going to let it kill him, to save me. The creature rose and struck out with its claws at Dad. It struck him in his arms, leaving 3 gashes as my father fell backwards to the ground. I needed to move. I needed to get up. I needed to run. He's going to sacrifice himself for me. And all I could do was sit and stare as it happened. I pushed myself up with my arms, eyes locked on the scene before me. My hand brushed against something metal. I looked down to see my father's 30-30 lying next to me. The creature stepped forward and fell over to my father, looming over him and pinning him to the ground. I yanked up the gun and readied it in my arms. You can help it, son. Always find something to balance your gun on. Don't ever shoot it just holding it unless you have to. I adjusted my position, sitting down, raised my knees to rest the gun on them, like my dad always did when shooting that deer. Dad yelled something at me. I thought it was run, but I couldn't hear it over the sound of that creature hissing. Relax, son. Close one eye, keep focused on the target. I rolled my shoulders, forcing my muscles to relax, and closed an eye, letting the sight focus in on the drilling head of that monster. The monster opened its mouth and screeched in my dad's face, drool oozing out and over my father as my dad shut his eyes and turned away. Now, when you're ready, hold your breath. Don't hold it for too long or you're going to start shaking. Just enough. I held in a breath and held it. I took in a breath and held it, the gun steadying in my hands as my breathing halted for a moment. The creature's arm rose, claws lifting and ready to flay into my father. This was it. I'd have one chance. If I missed, my dad would die. Then, slowly squeezed the trigger down, like you're milking a cow. My fingers slowly squeezed down on the trigger as I tried my best to imagine what milking a cow must be like. Creature's clawed hand fell downward. Bam! The shot rang out. I could hear a sick crunching noise mixed with that of a splatter. Creature howled and lurched off of my dad, his oversized hands grasping its head in pain. I could see what I thought was blood pouring out of the side of its deformed skull, and jerked around, stumbling on its feet before it turned and snarled at me. Then it turned and took off, running back into the woods. I sat there in silence, panting as sweat poured down my face. Soon my eyes moved back to my dad. He was lying there, not moving. Swiftly, I rose and slid down next to him. Dad? I cried out to him. Dad, come on! He blinked and stared up at me before his arms rose and wrapped around me in a tight hug. I hugged him back and closed my eyes. We were okay. Both of us were okay. Soon, my father let go and pushed himself up to his feet. He glanced back toward the woods as a hand rose to wipe some of that foul-smelling drool away from his face. He began with a slight stammer, before he lifted a hand and placed it on my shoulder. I taught you good, he spoke. I couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. We didn't waste any time. 2 of us got into that car and drove. Neither of us said anything until the car pulled out of that winding, bumpy road and went to a solid highway nearly an hour later. I was the first to speak. What do you think it was? I asked quietly as my head turned toward him. I don't know, was the only reply I got. What are we going to do about John? What are we going to say about John? The truth. He was attacked by an animal. We shot it, but we think it got away. He sighed and hung his head. I knew he felt responsible for John. It wasn't his fault, though. It was that thing's fault. Nobody would believe it if we said a monster got him. So, an animal. It had to be an animal. We were silent for a bit longer before I spoke in a quiet, nervous tone. What if that thing comes back? I asked, as my eyes focused on my father. What if it follows you, comes after us again? My dad did something surprising. He smirked. He smirked and shook his head. I'm not scared if it does. That surprised me. I gave him an odd look, like he had finally gone crazy. Dad, that thing took a bullet to the face. You're not scared of it? Son, he began as he glanced at me, confident look on his face. You shot that thing in the head, and it howled and ran away. That means it was hurt, meaning it was scared of getting hurt more. And if it's scared of getting hurt more, and that grin on his face grew wider, that means we could kill it.